This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Nizzahon, and it's Saturday, and that means it's time for another edition of Nizzanotes, my weekly vlog series where I talk about limited magic, and today we're continuing to talk about Streets of New Capenna. It's still the newest limited format out there. In last week's video, I sort of asked the question, is this one of the worst formats we've ever had on Arena? And at the time, I was really leaning in the direction of, yes, it is, probably worse than the set that I think is the worst in the Arena era, which is Forgotten Realms. But I've softened on that a little bit. At the end of the video last week, I did sort of have, a hope that once everyone is overdrafting brokers, and that's the main problem, the brokers decks are way better than the other ones. And my hope was other people would start drafting brokers, a lot of people, and then that would make the other decks better and the brokers decks worse. And that has happened. But it hasn't solved all the problems the format has. Brokers decks are still too good. There isn't really a space for more controlling decks in the format for the most part. You really need to end up with some uncommons and rares if you're ever going to be able to catch back up from behind in this format. There aren't really commons that can do it for you, and that makes this format kind of one-dimensional. But, I do feel like the format is no longer worse than Forgotten Realms. It might be a notch above it instead, so that's still not great. But either way, it's a solid format-ish in the end, I think. And this week I wanted to talk about there's basically 5 archetypes in the format, and I wanted to rank each of them, talk about some of the key cards for them. In particular, we're going to look at the obvious gold cards, but I'm also going to talk about a key common for each deck. So let's go ahead and jump in to that. So I have 2 decks in the top tier, 2 decks in the second tier, and 1 deck in a third tier. So at the very top tier, I have white-blue. So yeah, this format has these 3 color families, but generally, as I talked about last week, you end up in a 2-color deck that's splashing the 3rd color in a particular family. And so when I say white-blue, I mean that's the core of your deck. It's a white-blue deck. And then you're usually splashing green. So in other words, I'm talking about a broker's deck here at the very top. In particular, though, the blue-white deck is more interested in counters. Your gold common is incredibly good, and that's a big part of why this deck is so good. Celestial Regulator can come down and tap things down, freeze them down, while adding a real body to the board. And it's really not that hard to have something with a counter on it when you play it on turn 3, because there's plenty of commons that let you do it. You also have 2 signpost uncommons, Exotic Pets and Metropolis Angel, but frankly, I think the Regulator is better than either of them, and that's kind of a funny thing here. I think the common is better than the 2 uncommons, don't get me wrong. Exotic Pets making the 2 bodies and getting some tokens is nice, and Metropolis Angel drawing you cards is nice, but the Regulator gives you the most efficient body of them all, while also having a very powerful and easy to trigger into the battlefield ability. So, in this white-blue deck, you're usually splashing green. I'm not going to talk about the straight-up brokers cards, because they're pretty much, the 3-color cards at uncommon and stuff are mostly just really good, and you'll play them in the deck, like the 2-1 double striker with the shield counter and stuff like that. But, the token aspect is the big thing you're taking off on if you're in white-blue. And the key common, that's not a gold card that I have for this deck, is Raffine's Informant. This is a 2-mana 2-1 that connives when it enters the battlefield. So this is the kind of card that sets up your turn 3 Celestial Regulator. It helps you filter through cards. It can get a counter. It's just a great 2-drop in a format where 2-drops really matter. I should say you can also end up as black as your 3rd color in this deck. And that's still a pretty good deck, but I do think it's better when you're going with green, just because you have access to better gold cards. But you can be Obscura and also care about these things, especially because Connive more generally gives you more counters. So the deck, I did say green at the beginning. It can be white, blue, black, or white, blue, and then green as your 3rd color. But white, blue is usually your core. The next deck in this top tier is green, white. And not generally, here you pretty much do have to splash blue. The other guilds, the other groups don't work as well here, mostly because red is just a relatively weak color overall in the format, which is one of its problems. But the green-white deck, and you usually splash blue, is a pretty good one, and it's about citizens. Your common is Civil Servant, a 2-mana 2/3 that when it attacks, you can tap another citizen and it gets +1/+0 and gains lifelink. It's a very quality 2-drop in a format, again, where 2-drops matter. You've also got Darling of the Masses, who's a citizen lord that cranks out more citizens, quite good. And then Ceremonial Groundbreaker, which I think of these three is the best, because equipping this to citizens, whether they're tokens or otherwise, gives you a very formidable creature. Yeah, this deck is about citizens, whether they're tokens or creatures with the type. And I think the key common here, I have Backup Agent. This is because it is a citizen, and it's also just a nice card that's relevant all game long. It puts a counter on something, so it also goes well in the blue-white deck, of course. So it's a second common you can get that sets up a turn 3 regulator. So there's 2 of those. Probably not a great idea for the format, but that's how it is. But yeah, so Backup Agent has the right type, and then the ability to put counters on things. You know, both of these decks are going to overlap some. You'll have some +1/+1 counter payoffs, and you'll have some citizen payoffs in these because of the colors you're in. But these are the 2 best decks. They're both mostly brokers. Sometimes you go Obscuro with the white-blue deck, but green-white and white-blue are really the best places to go overall. And you're usually splashing a 3rd color to play some powerful 3-color cards. So that's the first tier, 2 brokers decks. That hasn't changed even as it's been drafted even more. The second tier, at the very top of that tier, I have black-red, generally with a blue splash, but you can also do it with a green splash. The blue splash is Maestros, and the green splash is Riveteers. But this deck I actually find most frequently just being straight up black-red in. You can do that with any of these, by the way. You don't necessarily need to splash a 3rd color. Often it's worth it for a powerful gold card, 3-colored card. But in black-red, that's the deck I find myself playing as just a straight-up 2-color deck the most out of all 5 of these. And the theme here is Sacrifice. And so you've got Body Dropper, a really powerful 2-drop. That's your common for this that has the ability to gain menace and sacrifice things, and it gets a counter when things get sacrificed. That's quite powerful. Generally, combining it with cards with Blitz or with Casualty is pretty good. Blitz has really proven to be the more powerful of those sacrifice mechanics, but both of them go really well with Body Dropper. You've got a couple of uncommons too. One of them's Forge Boss, who's excellent. He adds an extra 2 damage to every creature you blitz is one way to look at it, and that's quite good. And then your other uncommon is a bit of a disappointment. It's Fatal Grudge. It's okay. You'll play it in this deck, but you'd rather have Body Dropper and Forge Boss, as many copies of those as possible, and no copies of Fatal Grudge. Like, if you could turn it into a copy of one of those, you would. And so it's not the greatest card, but it does fit with this deck's theme. And I think the key common here is Girder Goons. This has been one of the few commons in this set that's not in Broker's colors that's really good. And it is. Girder Goons is quite good. You blitz it in and you get a ton of value usually because you basically pay 4 to attack your opponent with a relevant body, a 4/4 that they can maybe chump, or they usually can't block it effectively without losing a creature, so they usually just take it, and then you get a 2/2 left behind, and there's 2 bodies involved here. Often you get a 2-for-1 and even a 3-for-1. Well, not really a 3-for-1. Usually a 2-for-1 out of this, but it's really gross when you can blitz something and then also sack it to some other effect, like a casualty effect in your second main phase. There's some gross stuff you can do here, and this deck is pretty good. I mean, I like this deck a lot. Like I said, you end up with a blue splash or a green splash in it most often, but the best versions of this deck are core black-red with a splash of one of those colors, and I've liked that deck a lot. So the second deck I have within this second tier, and I think these decks are perfectly good, is the blue-black deck, where you end up with either red or white as your splash color, but blue-black really at your core. With red, you're a Maestro's deck, obviously, and with white, you are a Obscura deck. And so you can end up in either of those places. This deck is the graveyardiest deck in the format. You have as your common Snooping Newsy, who loads your graveyard and has this check for 5 mana values ability. And it's actually pretty doable to get those going if you have enough different ways to mill yourself, and they're all over the format. You can do it with Connive as well. You can self-mill. There's just a lot of ways to do it. And, the Newsy isn't as powerful as a lot of these other... It's not as powerful at all as the Regulator, the Civil Servant, the Body Dropper. It's not as good as any of them. But it's solid. It's pretty good. It often becomes a 3/3 lifelinker. And lifelink is one of the ways you can really wreak havoc on some of the faster decks in the format. You've also got Syndicate Infiltrator and Tainted Indulgence as your uncommons. And these also, not amazing. I mean, the Infiltrator will often be a 5/5 late. The Indulgence is pay 2 to draw 2, but they're definitely not as good of a collection of gold cards as we've seen with the first 3 decks, and that's part of what makes it worse. And your key common here, I think, is Expendable Lackey. This is good in all the blue decks, of course, but this deck is the one where you have the most potential overlap into good ways to load your graveyard and discard cards between the blue-black deck and then the connive mechanic. So the Lackey ending up in your graveyard gives you nice value, and you can also discard it to connive, and you can also discard it, or sacrifice it rather, to Casualty. And there are some nice Casualty 1 cards around. So those are the 4 decks that I don't feel bad. I mean, I feel great if the 2 Brokers decks we talked about in the top tier are open. I feel great. If the second tier decks are pretty open, I feel pretty good about ending up in them. And usually if I do, it means Brokers wasn't very open. And then there's a 3rd tier. And I do think now, last week I said maybe some of these things are unplayable. I'm not quite as harsh on that. I think all 5 of these basic archetypes are playable now. But the 3rd tier is still sort of the cabaret Riveteer's Overlap, which is the red-green deck, which you can add either black or white to, depending on whether you're doing a Cabaret Splash or a Riveteer's Splash. So this deck's supposed to be about treasure, and it's really funny because going into the format, it was like, a treasure deck like this in a format with all these powerful 3-colored cards, like that could be a thing. But the format is just so unforgiving, and it's so hard to get back ahead from behind that sort of dinking around, playing inefficient things that make you treasure, not adding to the board, stuff like that is just bad in this format. And the problem is a lot of what you have going on in this group in red-green / white / black, you have the same kind of things. You have the kind of things going on that are sort of clunky. You have access to some nice stuff. I mean, Jetmir's Fixer is actually a pretty good gold common. I think it's probably a little better than Snooping Newsy, though it doesn't compare to Body Dropper's Civil Servant or the Regulator. You've also got Security Rhox, who is, a decent little creature. He's not little, but, 4 mana 5/4 is fine, and you can cast it cheaper sometimes, but it's definitely pales in comparison to most of what we've seen so far. And then Stimulus Package, I think, has overall been a bummer. There are some funny combos you can do, especially if you get the rare Gala Greeters with Stimulus Package, because, you can make treasure with that and then generate more tokens. You can only do it once a turn, but it's sort of like the Oven Cat combo from Standard. It's not quite as broken, but there is a combo to be had at, but it takes an uncommon and a rare. But yeah, I mean, it makes you treasure, and then you can turn that treasure into creatures. It's all right. This deck, it just doesn't do enough. It can't keep up power level wise with what the others are doing, and you can just see that with the commons and uncommons. But, it can be a pretty aggressive deck. I think the best version of this isn't one that does silly treasure things. It's just the one that plays like the really efficient creatures you have access to within these colors, and you just kind of curve out and don't pay that much attention to synergy, though you're liable to have some treasures around. And I think the key common here is Exhibition Magician, and I have it here because whether you have some treasure payoffs that you're interested in using, or you're interested in ramping, or if you're interested in going wide and triggering Alliance, which is what Cabaret's interested in, it can do that too. So, the Magician is a solid little common. I do think it's worse than Expendable Lackey, Girder Goon's Backup Agent, and Raffine's Informant, though. So you can see, just the cards we're talking about here as the core cards for this deck kind of pale in comparison to what we've talked about so far. And we saw that sort of declining the further down we went. I think the first 3 decks we talked about, white, blue, green, white, and black, red, those 3 have the best of these, commons and uncommons. And then in blue-black, you're ending up with a little bit of a disappointment. And then in red-green, you really are. So that's how I have these ranked for now. I think that's probably where I'll end up. I mean, I'm 30-plus drafts into the format at this point. And it feels like this is where things will be. Things have leveled out more. The gap between the top tier and bottom tier has been reduced. And that's good. It makes the format better than it looked like it was going to be. But there are still problems. All right, so let's do a crack-a-pack now and close out this edition of Nizzanotes. I'm going to show you a pack. I'm going to talk about each card in it and tell you what I would first pick. All right, so here's our pack. Our first common is Chrome Cat. you don't really find yourself playing this. There's a lot of 3-drops in this format, and they all really are better than Chrome Cat for the most part. You'll play it if you're desperate for a creature, if things went sideways in your draft, but that's usually not a good thing. I mean, it's passable, but these days you can end up with way better 3-drops, and the cat's just not very good. If it was a 2-drop, like a 2-mana 2/1 that scryed 1, it would be a lot better, just because there aren't that many 2-drops in the format, and you have to load up on them if you're going to have a chance, but it's not. So it's a 3-drop and you don't want it. Jetmir's Fixture we just talked about. You definitely don't want to be first picking this. You kind of wait for these on the wheel. You usually get them if you want them. It is a nice little 2-drop though. Echo Inspector's next. This card's nice. It does seem like you end up with a lot of 3 and 4 drops in this format, and you end up having to cut them to reduce your curve. And so there's only so many Echo Inspectors you can take. So I definitely wouldn't first pick one, but the 2 outcomes you get with it are good, whether it's a 4-mana 3/4 flyer or a 4-mana 2/3 that lets you dig for a real card when you need one. Either way, works out as a decent card, but not something you first pick. Cutthroat Contender, not especially good. It's not a complete disaster. It's a low drop, and it's one that can trade for a lot of 2-drops. And it works well if you have some Casualty 2 cards. But you do really have to end up in a very specific deck for it. You don't jam it into like your red-black sacrifice deck or anything like that most of the time. Definitely not a first pick. Case the Joint. This is maybe the worst card of the ones we've seen so far. And I know that sounds crazy because it's a 2-for-1, right? But paying 4 to not add to the board at all is a good way to get behind. And in a format where there aren't very many good ways to get back ahead from behind, you just can't afford to go behind on board for the future, because the future might be too far away. I think it's almost unplayable. There's probably some decks that can really they have a bunch of the 2-mana 3/3 guy they can play early and they can block with it. And you end up in a really controlling deck that can actually hold its own or something. You would play it, but you definitely don't first pick it, and you usually don't play it. Plasma Jockey, it's a nice blitz creature. It can allow you to get in for a ton of damage out of nowhere, but it isn't really something you take early either. You'll wheel them if you want them most of the time. Revel Ruiner, another fine card, has Connive, but it's also another 4-drop in a format with a lot of 4-drops. Just look at Echo Inspector, Plasma Jockey, and Revel Ruiner. And you'll play it in your decks. It makes the cut in a lot of black decks, whether you're interested in drawing cards or, being more aggressive with Connive. It works okay in both, but it's just a solid common, not much more. Warm Welcome's okay. It gets better if you have some incredible bomb in your deck that's kind of unbeatable, and there are a few of those in the format because it helps you dig for those. Sometimes you can use it and sort of ambush an X1, and that feels pretty good if you're also drawing a card, but I end up cutting this a lot from my green decks too. Next up, it's Kill Shot. This card is never great, but the presence of the blitz mechanic has made it even worse because you have fewer targets you actually want to hit. If your opponent's already blitzing in and planning on losing their creature, you don't really want to kill shot it because you're using up a card to give them back their card because they draw a card when it dies. And then they have that card in their second main phase instead of having to wait until the end of your turn. Playing 1 kill shot is acceptable if you really need removal, but it's weak enough to what's going on in this format. I mean, Murder, in a lot of ways, isn't great in this format, and it's way better than Kill Shot, so you can see how Kill Shot would be significantly worse. Inspiring Overseer. All right, well, now we have a card I feel good about first picking. I guess so far, by the way, I'd probably be on Echo Inspector. We had a pretty weak group of commons until we get to the Overseer, which there's probably only 10 or 15 rares and mythics you would take over in the format, and that's part of the problem and part of why going more hardcore 3 colors isn't worth it, because you have powerful monocolored cards like the Overseer, drawing a card, gaining you a life. It can attack in the air. It just gives you a ton of value, and it's an amazing common, and you feel ecstatic about first picking it. We've got 3 uncommons, of course. One of them's Patch Up. This can work okay in some decks, but it is, in your opening hand, it's not so good in a format where you need to add to the board right away, because you'd rather just have a 3-drop, even if it's a 3-mana 2/3. You'd rather have that than Patch Up in your opening hand. But Patch Up in the late game can do some interesting stuff. I don't think you usually play it, but I don't think it's entirely unplayable. Still on the Overseer. Illuminator Virtuoso, another white uncommon. This has been nice. There are, tricks are good in this format because they're a way to, like, if your opponent has to like tap out for one big creature and you're already sort of wide on the board and you can just swing at them and use a trick to punch through their creature. If you're putting your opponent in that position, it's hard to come back from. And so tricks have been great in this format. And there's a lot of them that are good with the Virtuoso, who gets bigger. It has double strike. You can also make it unblockable with Security Bypass, a card that's been surprisingly good. Virtuoso is good, but it requires a lot more effort than Inspiring Overseer. And I think in a vacuum, the Overseer is probably just better anyway. But it is a nice uncommon and one I wouldn't hate first picking. Angelic Overseer is our last uncommon, another white card. This has been one of the disappointments of the format for me anyway. I thought it would be easier to cast this for cheap, and you can, but it's usually like 5 for a 3/3. Sometimes it's less in the later game, but it is kind of a liability in a format where you need to be adding to the board earlier. But it's fine. You'll play it in like your green-white decks, of course, but it's not first pickable. So we're on the Overseer. Our rare is also white. That's 6 white cards in a row, which is kind of weird. And it's a good rare. It's Mysterious Limousine. I've been lucky enough to play this, I think, like 4 times. It is powerful. It comes down, it removes something, and then it gives you a reasonably sized vehicle. Now, you have to be careful about how you use it, because if they kill it, they get their thing back, but you can manufacture enough situations where it can attack, and you can even sort of bob around and give them back the thing under it and take something else. You can also exile your own thing if you have the time to do that, like your Overseer if you want to draw more cards, and then you can remove it. It also takes down tokens, and there's enough of those in the format for that to matter, and it is better than Inspiring Overseer. Now, the awkward thing about this pack is the 3 best cards in it are all white, and I don't think it's that close. The Overseer, the Virtuoso, and the Limousine, and that is a problem of sorts. But the Limousine being double white matters. Like, double colored cards are a little harder to play in this format on average, because you often end up with a third color as a splash color. But the Limousine's strong enough, and Mana's good enough that I think you take it here over the Overseer. I mean, no matter what, you're taking a white card here. You can't look at this pack and say, oh no, there's 3 good white cards in it. Maybe I'll take Echo Inspector, because it's just so much farther below these 3 white cards. So, Mysterious Limousine, it is. Very, very good card. Pretty strong pack in the end, even though our first string of commons all the way till the Overseer was pretty mediocre. So, that does it for this edition of Nizzanotes. I'll be back next week to talk some more. Maybe about Capenna, maybe, if this format ends up, sort of petering out because it's not that interesting, which is sort of where I feel like it might be right now. Maybe I'll talk about a more general limited topic. We'll just have to see. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. If you want to make sure that you're caught up on this series, you should see some playlists on your screen shortly. And lastly, if you want to go the extra mile in supporting me and the channel, you can on Patreon. Thanks for watching.